For years, the video game industry has experienced its ups and downs, and for the most part, it's also experienced its ins and outs. But the most famous of video game rivalries was from the late 80s, early 90s, when the legendary console makers locked horns in an epic showdown to show who was the best in the video game industry. After the video game market crash of 1983 caused by Atari, video games were seen as nothing more than a thing from the past. Then entered Nintendo. Little did we know, the epic feud between Nintendo and Sega was about to begin.
The Nintendo Entertainment System, NES for short, aka Famicom, launched in America July 18th, 1983. It launched one of the biggest selling gamer systems in gamers' history, reviving the gamers market from the crash of the Atari in 1983, appealing to retailers to stock the NES systems to apply accessories such as the laser gun, ROB, the robot, and the zapper. To appeal to retailers, Nintendo promised retailers that they will buy back all unsold systems.
The Sega Master System was the very first Sega console in the history of video games, but there's one other Sega console that came before the Master System, was released in Japan, but the less said about that system, the better. Not anything to say about it because it wasn't really that good. But unfortunately for Sega, Nintendo owned most of the video game market. They owned a lot of third-party developers and contracts, and they locked them all down. So by the time Sega came to the party, they didn't have anybody to make games for them. Hence the fact that they had to make their own in-house game for the Sega Master System, which in the long run hurt that system and made it so that only Sega games were released for it and no other creative games from any other company. So that means Mega Man just stayed on Nintendo and never was able to go on to a Sega console. So with that being said, they developed their own games for their Master System, and during the Sega era, and during this era in Sega, they had one mascot, and Alex the Kid. And pretty much Alex the Kid had less personality than a piece of cardboard. So not too fun to play with Alex the Kid in his games because quite frankly, there were Mario ripoffs, and although they were slightly creative, not as creative as the Mario games that came before Alex the Kid. With that being said, Alex the Kid didn't do that well, and Nintendo basically had a grip and a vice and a monopoly on the video game market as a whole.
Well, over time, the NES came with two sets. The first set was an arcade version, which has Super Mario Brothers, and I guess that was about it. The second set came with a deluxe version, well, which was the deluxe version, which was bundled with 3 games and a laser gun. Over time, it was sold with 60 million units in its own lifetime. Plus, the best games that actually got sold during that lifetime were Legend of Zelda and Super Mario Brothers. When they evolved with more systems, they've been making a lot of sequels, making it more fun to play.
After the revival of the video game industry by Nintendo, video games now needed more detailed graphics to expand the storytelling elements introduced by Nintendo's very own Shigeru Miyamoto. Sega beat them to the punch, however, with the Sega Genesis.
What Nintendo?
The Sega Genesis, also known as the Sega Mega Drive, was released in 1989 in the good old red, white, and blue US of A. Nintendo answered well and hard with their release of the Sega Genesis and proves that they were a master and a monster in the industry if they put their minds to it and released a system with quality and games behind it. With that being said, the system came with something called a blast processor. Something that's not really that big of a deal, and Sega basically tried to market the crap out of the blast processor, but nobody really cared. Sega Genesis basically took the Nintendo's light and spotlight, and they were now a leader in the industry since the Genesis came out, which is a really good thing for Sega.
With Nintendo's backs against the wall, Nintendo was forced into making a new system. Although they didn't rush the system, they took all their time and effort to make their new system. Later it would be known as, simply, the Super Nintendo.
The Super Nintendo was more updated, powerful, and pretty much better much better than this actual Sega Genesis. When you bought this system, it came with Super Mario World as a bundle inside of it. But over time, it changed into Donkey Kong, which was a very good game, better than Sonic.
Sega was in real need of a mascot. At this point, Sega only had Alex the Kid. Alex the Kid, quite frankly, couldn't cut it because, quite frankly, he had, as I said before, he didn't have the personality or the drive or just the plain good gameplay that Mario had to actually, be suited to be an actual good mascot for that company. So what Sega did was they got and they told all their employees that they had to go back and make a new mascot. They had a whole contest, they had a whole big thing inside the company to make a new mascot. So, a whole bunch of people were making new mascots. There was a hamster going around, then there was a bear, then there was a Roosevelt ripoff, then there was a whole bunch of other animals going around until finally, these guys made a hedgehog, a blue hedgehog called Sonic. First it was called Mr. Needlenose, but now it is called Sonic because, quite frankly, he goes at supersonic speeds, if you know what I'm saying. So now Sega released that mascot, and that mascot, Sonic, became successful overnight almost. It basically almost toppled the monopoly and the juggernaut that was known as Super Mario on the Nintendo side. But Sega had their great mascot known as Sonic the Hedgehog. They made a sequel to the first game called Sonic the Hedgehog 2, which had Tails in it. And then they made a third game on top of that with Knuckles in it. So at this point, Genesis was doing really well for itself and it was creating creative games. And to be quite frank and honest, the Genesis basically, even though Nintendo released way better games, Nintendo released great games every once in a while. Every blue moon they released a game on Nintendo. But it was a great game when they released it on Nintendo. But on the other hand, Sega released okay games. They released alright games. They were average. But basically, the reason why that was kind of working for them because they were releasing them more often. So we were going and releasing games here. They were releasing like 2 or 3 games a month. Nintendo was releasing a game 3 times a year. I mean, with that being said, Sega released some actual good quality games. They released Rise Star. They released Echo the Dolphin. They released Streets of Rage, which is an instant classic and could go head to head with Final Fight from Capcom, which never released on the Sega system, by the way, just letting you know that. But also, they even released more Sonic games, as I said before, and they released Vector Man. Basically, Vector Man was the Metroid of the Sega side, and quite frankly, that game was an instant cult classic onto itself. So Sega had Sonic the Hedgehog and Nintendo had Super Mario, and they basically clashed with each other. So Sega overall, they just boom, 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 game after game after game, average game, release after release after release. Those games were just okay. Those games were pretty much average, with the exception of Sonic the Hedgehog series. Nintendo had lost their competitive edge, and Sega had finally leaped into the majority share of the market, and Sega was a monster at this point. Nintendo, on the other hand, even though they released better games, they fell into second place because, quite frankly, they released greater and better games, but they released them just a little bit less than Sega released average games on a normal basis. So you can see where that was going at that time.
With Sega now in the lead thanks to aggressive ad campaigns and marketing, Nintendo now had to play catch up with Sega's blue-haired mascot. Nintendo was going to have to think outside the box for this one.